Right. Well, hello everyone from the American Palliative Rehab Alliance. My name is Chris Wilson. I'm a physical therapist, and I'm very excited to be one of the co-leaders of this organization with Ann Henshaw.
Hi, I'm Ann Henshaw. I live in the DC area. I work clinically at Georgetown University Hospital and teach at GW. And Chris and I are very interested in exploring the space of palliative care and end of life care from a rehab lens and getting all the people that work with patients that are seriously ill on the same page. So we are very excited today to be bringing you a special guest. And we'll let Jo introduce herself, I think.
Hi, so thank you so much for inviting me, and what a privilege it is to be talking with you this evening for me. Um, my name's Jo Bailey. I'm a physiotherapist by background, physical therapist, I think, in the US. I qualified 37 years ago, but moved into palliative care in the early 90s, initially working in an HIV and AIDS unit before triple therapy, when HIV and AIDS was a much more frequently life-limiting condition. And then I just got a lucky break. They started to build a hospice in the grounds of the hospice where I worked, and the consultant, a chap called Dr. Jed Corcoran, did a lunchtime talk in the physiotherapy department where I worked. I'd never previously considered working with people towards end of life, but working on the HIV unit, I'd found it very powerful and moving to be supporting people to live well, even with very rapidly deteriorating health, and helping people to retain their sense of self and identity as they move towards an end of life that they knew was coming. So I heard this guy, Jed Corcoran, doing a lunchtime talk and telling us about this hospice he was building, and I thought, I want to work for him. I want to work there. And so I applied for the job and got it. That was in January 1996. And we all started on a snowy day, and I stayed there for just short of 20 years and looked after hundreds and thousands of patients with a really exceptional multi-professional team of doctors, nurses, occupational therapists, physios, social workers, pastoral care workers from the get-go. We were a very rehab-focused hospice from the get-go. And I think, just to clarify, in the UK, hospices are buildings as well as services. They're actual places where you go. And yeah, so that's me. It's my background. I was there for nearly 20 years. And then in 2016, I had a research question that a patient gave me in the hospice. I can talk about that later. And thought, I just want to go and study this. I want to see whether this works, because there was no evidence for what we were doing. And there's no evidence, nobody wants to pay for it. So I thought, I'm going to go and do a PhD. And I looked up who was doing the best research. My youngest daughter had gone to university, and I went and lived near him, so I could near the university he worked, so I could do my PhD with him. And my PhD led me to being a research fellow and ultimately to Inspire.
You know, Jo, I didn't know we shared that in common. I went back and got my doctorate in occupational therapy when my youngest was just finishing college. So
Yeah,
there
great
you go.
time. A great
Lifelong
time to
learning.
learn.
Yeah,
Because
lifelong
I did
learning.
my PhD, and I always think about that all my patients and their families were on my shoulders when I was doing my PhD.
Yes.
It wasn't just the theory, although I love the theory and that's really important, but it was the theory interacting with all those experiences.
100%. Yes, yes, because you can bring all that and
Yeah.
you wait a minute, that's not how it really
Yeah.
works.
Yeah,
This is
I
how
could
it
hear
really
them
works.
saying, because I was living in Liverpool, and I could hear them saying, "Hey Joe, that's not going to work." In Liverpool, I said, you don't want to do it like that.
No, 100%. I had the same experience. I was like, wait, no, that's insurance won't pay for that or whatever. You have all these
Yeah,
barriers, and it's fine to break down barriers. We like to
yeah,
do that, right? But we have to recognize them in order to do
exactly.
so.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we invited Jo to come in and talk, not just because she's I'll try and make her blush a little bit, a world-renowned expert in this topic
Ooh.
of palliative rehabilitation, but also to kind of bring a little bit of an international perspective, which might be a little bit confusing because we're the American Palliative Rehab Alliance, but that's actually what I did my doctoral thesis on when I was in school, was that as Jo said, in the United States, there really wasn't much evidence at all on the efficacy of rehab as it relates to palliative care. And I knew there were little pockets of people around the country and around the world So I just kind of started doing qualitative interviews of different physios at the time, to really find out that, if somebody in Italy or England or Singapore or anywhere else is kind of, all the physios are doing the same thing. That's kind of what floats to the top. At least at the beginning, that's what we should be kind of starting to focus our practice on, because that's kind of what enough of our experience and gut instinct is telling us. So I guess the first question is, Joe, I don't know how much you know about the US healthcare system. I know we've chatted about it offline, but I didn't know if you could kind of talk about what that chronic disease management, palliative, end of life care planning or care activities look like in the UK. I know it's a big
Yeah,
question.
I think maybe as in many countries, it's quite siloed according to your disease specialty. So I think historically rehabilitation began, didn't it, in trauma centres. It was for people who had been injured in war zones and then in industrial accidents. And a lot of rehabilitation was group-based, exercise-based, shop-based, in the original origins of occupational therapy. And it was very much focused around tasks and strength and getting people back into the troops or the workplace. And then I think over the years, rheumatological conditions came on board, and then neurological conditions, and gradually rehabilitation became kind of integrated into specialties. So that when I was training in the mid 80s, you would, if you had a stroke, um, anybody in the street would expect you to have physio. If somebody in your family had a stroke, people assumed that you would have physio. They kind of understood some of the things that occupational therapists did. They might not have known the word, but they kind of knew that they might need a wheelchair and they might need to have adaptations at home. So they kind of knew what was available for them. And when I was qualifying, it was when they were starting to do all the randomized controlled trials of pulmonary rehabilitation. Pulmonary rehabilitation. It's hard to say that.
Sure.
And people were very pessimistic about it. I do remember that the first acute trust I worked in, and people didn't expect chronic smokers to be able to participate in these quite intense exercise programs, to be able to commit to them.
Mhm.
And now look where we are. It's a gold standard treatment. It's one of the most effective treatments for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Same with cardiac rehab. Um, really, really effective rehabilitation, properly integrated into cardiac care. Go to orthopedics. I don't know what it's like in the USA, but in the UK, orthopedic surgeons would not do their operations. They would not do their hip replacements, their knee replacements, if they didn't have good prehab and post-op rehab. Why put all this expense and effort into these surgeries if we can't rehabilitate the person after, just to get the best out of it? For some reason, cancer and end of life care just never seem to get a look in. And I think cancer rehab has only really started to progress when it's about saving money in health service systems, when it's about improving throughput in surgical units and improving perioperative morbidity. And I think the whole prehab movement and exercise-based prehab and smoking cessation prehab it's been fantastic to see, and I think it's really important. I think we've yet to see, and some of your listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've yet to see the benefits on long-term functional outcomes. I think we've got good perioperative outcomes, and then palliative. That's another ball game altogether. And I think, go on, sorry, Anne. Yeah.
So is palliative care growing as much in England or as it is here? I mean, is that a force, or has that always been big? Like a
No,
large.
I think so we'll park rehab and cancer for a moment, and then let's look at palliative care. So palliative care in the UK started getting big from the 1960s onwards.
Okay.
And that was when we had the development of the modern hospice movement. And in the UK, like I said, very definitely a building, a place where people could go to die.
Mhm.
And in the early years, it was very much focused on the quality of dying. And very much end of life, the last weeks of life, weeks and months. And then over the years, palliative care in the UK extended backwards. The hospice movement and palliative care extended backwards in the life course, so that it was trying to support people to live well. I mean, then that's what Dame Cicely herself said. Even at the get-go, she wanted people to live well, even in those last weeks and months of life. I think it's interesting if you look at the early palliative care textbooks, in fact, even some recent palliative care textbooks, look at who the palliative care team is. You know, it's often the doctors, the physicians, the nurses, the chaplains, the spiritual advisors, the social workers. And it tells you a lot about, and the psychologists, counsellors, it tells you a lot about where we're going with our care here, what the focus of our care is. And the absence of healthcare professionals who provide rehabilitation, I think, is telling. And when I first started working in the hospice in 1996, I was quite scared of people who were dying. I was quite scared that I might harm them as a physiotherapist. I wasn't confident that my physio techniques that I'd employed in other specialties, I think I moved to the hospice from infectious diseases, would be applicable. So palliative care has really expanded massively. And I think in the UK, we're probably one of the most well-developed palliative care services in the world, but rehabilitation, even in the UK, is not fully integrated.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. No, our growth obviously in the past even 20 years has been remarkable. And as you say, we are not necessarily a seat at the table. We're an ancillary. And if they need us, we might come in. But it's interesting, back to your cancer piece. I literally had an oncologist tell me today that the patient didn't have enough energy for therapy. You know,
Yes.
totally missing our fatigue management, sleep hygiene, all of the things that mindfulness-based intervention, if it's pain that's, you know, interfering with energy. Anyway, so that struck home. I was like, well.
And I do have that, you know, I think a big part of what we really have to do is really do a lot of education of our patients, our doctors, our colleagues, and even ourselves. I mean, I think there's even some therapists, a lot of therapists who don't practice in this realm, that don't understand why would you be rehabilitating someone who's eventually going to die of their disease. And you know, especially as a physical therapist, maybe more than OT even, I think there's a little bit of a fear of us overdoing things and mucking up the
Definitely.
works. You know, it's over rehabilitating some of these patients, which to a certain extent that is a concern. But I think there's a lot of providers that, you know, I explain it to them, you know, we're not like a light switch where it's full blast on or full blast off. We're a little bit more like a dimmer switch. You know, when the patient's having a good day, we can turn the light on a little bit. And when they're having a rough day, we can turn the light off or turn it down and modify our interventions a little bit.
Yeah, it's a nice analogy. Yeah, absolutely. I think people perceive rehabilitation, definitely physio, as being effortful and potentially burdensome. You know, that we might hurt people, we might make them do things they don't want to do, and that's a hard image to shake off. You know, and I think it's I mean, there's an American, I think Dietz was writing in American textbooks back in the 80s, wasn't he? You know, his models of rehabilitation, preventative, restorative, supportive, and palliative. I mean, that's quite dated now, but it's still highly relevant. I think in the West we have very restorative models of rehabilitation. That is by far the dominant model of rehab. I think in the US, maybe because of your tariff-based system, your insurance-based system, and in the UK even, the model is still generally quite restorative, and we see rehabilitation as helping people to recover to a previous level of function rather than helping them to support them to the changes of their condition or even their decline. So I think in my PhD, I went to the ethics committee for the feasibility trial that preceded Inspire, and somebody on the ethics committee panel said to me, rehabilitation, lung cancer, aren't you offering them false hope? You know, it's again, it's a hard image to shake.
Right. No, as Chris said, we are educating all the time, right? Both, you know, doctors I just read an article. I don't know if you read it. It's in the OT literature. Actually, I think it was in American Journal of Palliative Medicine by Janice Kishi Chow, and it's Missed Opportunities to Ease Suffering is what it's called.
Oh no, I haven't seen that. I would like to read
send
that.
it to
Send
you,
me the link.
Yes, I will. But she talks about the education piece of ourselves, right? Like Chris mentioned, right? Like, because yes, some therapists might not understand that dimmer switch, Chris, that you
Yeah.
were talking about. And we need to make sure people do. And also, obviously, you know, whoever orders the services, the doctors or the nurse practitioners, but also she talks about this whole group called influencers. And I liked the term because it could be the nurses that are on the floor, or it could be family members, or it could be really anybody else that might have knowledge of our role in this space and be able to advocate for that.
Mhm.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're always educating though, right? What we could
I
do.
think, yeah, and there's a wonderful philosopher called Havi Carell. She's a British philosopher and she's a phenomenologist. And she has written a wonderful book called Illness, the Cry of the Flesh. And she talks about how through your life, the envelope of your being, what's inside the envelope of things that you do changes all through your life. And
Mhm.
as you go from being a toddler to a child, to a school child, to a student, to a worker, to a parent, you're always changing the envelope of things that you do, and things fall away and you pick up new things, and it's just natural. But for some reason, we're not very good at supporting people to let go of things and pick up new things when the cause of the change is a bit more visible, when our bodies become visible to us because of disease or pain
Yeah.
or whatever. And I think that rehab, I mean, she has this wonderful phrase, which I quoted in my thesis. I wrote to her and asked if I could use her writings in as chapter headings. And
Mhm.
it's that it's about reconfiguring the ability to be. And
I love
I love the idea of rehab, helping people reconfigure, who am I in my world? What am I doing? What do I want to do today? What am I doing now? What's important to me? And, you know, going back to those people who think that rehab isn't important, if we were in acute trauma, we wouldn't think twice about giving somebody a pair of crutches to support them until they can get back on. Well, what happens if the person needs the crutches forever?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then they have the crutches, and then they need a row later, and then they need a wheelchair. But they still want to participate in their family. They still want agency over decisions.
Mhm.
That to me is rehab, reconfiguring it, supporting recovery when possible, but also supporting decline and helping to optimize people's agency and functioning in the areas that matter to them for as long as possible.
Yeah. Decline with dignity, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's what we're
yeah,
trying to help. We're
Yeah.
really trying to help people decline with some level of dignity.
No,
yeah.
I love it. Yeah. So, one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about, Joe, is you had some involvement in, and hopefully you can tell us a little bit about that through the World Health Organization European region. And we'll put the link to the article that Anne mentioned when we post this video, but we'll also put it for the policy brief. So there's a policy brief on integrating rehabilitation into palliative care services, which I personally was ecstatic about. I think this is one of those things that really is going to be a
I
world
hope
change.
so.
Yeah.
And to the point where I was working with some folks in Nigeria on an article, and we talked about how they can bring this document to even within their limited resource health systems and say, hey, this is why we need to be here and what we need to do. So I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about maybe what the document is and maybe kind of how it started a little bit.
Yeah, so I think we were invited, or I think we bid for the brief with the WHO office. I don't know how these things work. I was working on the team who got the bid, and then I was invited to write it. I did, and I think the point of the brief really was just to try and pull together as much of the evidence as possible. As Anne said earlier, palliative care has expanded across the world, and it's trying to, where does rehab fit into that role of expanding palliative care? And it's the World Health Organization recognizes that rehabilitation and palliative care are both really important parts of universal health coverage. So high quality health services will have good quality palliative care services and good quality rehab. And the policy brief helps to bring those together. I think as well within rehabilitation, a lot of the rehabilitation strategies that we use in palliative care have their evidence base in kind of they're piecemeal. So there's evidence for exercise in cancer and palliative care. There's evidence for breathlessness interventions. There's evidence for task practice and assistive devices. But it was bringing all these things together in the kind of conceptual framework of what are the goals of palliative care. And if you think of the goals of palliative care as to relieve suffering, and the goals of rehabilitation are to optimize functioning. Where is the synergy? And it's around that the palliative care services, when they're thinking about relieving suffering, may not recognize that the role of function, the role that losing function plays in suffering. And so they may not pay attention to function. And if you look at kind of a lot of the needs assessment tools for palliative care, they're not very good at identifying function and changes in function. You know, can I still get on and off my toilet with dignity? I don't want to have somebody take me to the toilet. I want to be able to get on and off the toilet on my own. And rehabilitation often it optimizes function, but does it recognize the role that suffering plays in minimizing function? And it's not often, it's not necessarily physical limitations. It might be limitations around beliefs and expectation. What is possible for me to achieve with my condition? And I think if we recognize that rehab practitioners need to expand the scope of their practice to recognize suffering and what causes suffering and how they can contribute to minimizing suffering. And likewise, palliative care practitioners need to recognize that functioning in itself can be a cause of suffering, the loss of functioning. So, you know, how significant it is for somebody else not to be able to get upstairs and sleep in their own bedroom with their partner of 40, 50 years. We can glibly offer them a bed downstairs because you can stay at home, but not recognizing the suffering involved in that. So I think that's where we need to synergize, is to recognize the role that we both play in minimizing suffering to improve function and optimizing function to reduce suffering. And the brief pulls all that together, pulls the evidence together. But more importantly, it addresses, well, why isn't this happening? It seems so obvious. It's not rocket science. And so what are the barriers? Why isn't this happening? And I think it addresses the kind of the fact that a lot of these conditions are being managed across disparate medical specialties and in silos. And that there's a lack of evidence and lack of push in national policies and guidelines. So if it's not, like we said earlier, if it's not written down in your policies, if your insurance companies in the US don't require people to have optimized rehab to get the best out of their palliative anti-cancer treatments or their immunotherapies, then it won't get funded. But likewise, we've got a workforce issue because a lot of therapists aren't necessarily skilled. They're scared of working with people who are dying because it's not part of the undergraduate curriculum. In the UK, there's still a big focus on the main traditional specialties of respiratory care, neurology, musculoskeletal, care of the elderly. And given that 1 in 3 people die of cancer, or will get cancer, 1 in 3 people will get cancer, many of those will survive it. It's madness that we're not teaching cancer and palliative care as part of the undergraduate syllabuses, and we're not. So the policy brief addresses these issues and offers solutions that health systems can take at multiple levels, at the level of the patient and the practitioner, and at the level of the health system, and at the level of the government, to try and remove some of these barriers and to initiate some of these solutions. And it's got a lot of references in, so it'll be useful for people writing assignments.
True, yeah.
Likewise, it's going to go out of date quite quickly and will need to be reviewed, I'm sure.
You mentioned one barrier that I would love to just get your take on a little bit, and that is these silos. Trying to build bridges across these different disciplines has really been my passion. How do I get, if it's a cancer patient that has mets to the spine, and, neurosurgeon just saying one thing, and, we've got so many people weighing in. Do you have any thoughts, or what were some of the, how can we fix that? What could we do besides education we've already talked about?
Yeah, and I think, oh gosh, where to start?
I know. It's a big problem.
It's a big one, and I think a lot of it is to do with budgets and funding, and I think in the UK budgets are really tight post-COVID. It's become very challenging, and I think people try to control their spend by limiting who can access their service or over defining who can access service. So we become service orientated rather than need orientated, and we put clinicians in a terrible position. And if you're in the UK, if you're a community rehabilitation team and you take referrals from everybody, from the general practitioners, you're having to prioritize your list somehow. You've got all these patients being referred, you've got
Yeah.
a limited workforce. How do you prioritize patients?
Mhm.
And I can remember a community physiotherapist saying to me once in Liverpool, how do I prioritize between the young man with muscular dystrophy who wants to go on his first independent holiday and the person approaching end of life? We put terrible pressures on the clinicians. But then also we create these strange rules that you can only come to this service if you're over 65, or you can only come to this service if you've got a Rockwood Frailty score of 5, or you can only come to this service if you've got a neurological condition or a respiratory condition. You can come to this exercise group as long as you've got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but not if you've got lung cancer.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a wonderful service up in Scotland, just in case anybody listens to this from Ayrshire. I want to give a shout out to them. It's called HARP, HARP, and they provide a community-based rehab service for people with any health condition.
Great.
And I don't know why that model isn't spread more widely. Certainly the hospices in the UK that have the hospice buildings that have occupational therapists and physiotherapists would offer that model. So
Mhm.
for a UK hospice, even though the majority of referrals are probably still cancer, it's increasing now. The percentage of, or the proportion of non-cancer patients is increasing all the time. And especially in flagship hospices like St Christopher's in South London, St Joseph's in Hackney, and there are many hospices across the UK. The hospice I worked at, Woodlands Hospice in Liverpool, had really good multi-professional teams of where it wasn't just the OTs and the physios who were thinking from a rehab point of view, it was the nurses and the medics as well. And again, you're looking at the personalized, what are their needs, what matters to them, how are their comorbidities impacting on each other and their context, their social circumstances, their beliefs, their family setup, their finances. How is this all interacting together, and what can they do to help themselves? What are they doing already that's working? Asset-based approach. And where can we fill with gaps? Where can we support?
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think those models of care, I think we know what the models of care are. I
Yeah.
just think we need to implement
Yeah.
it. We need to
Dick.
persuade the funders and the policymakers to implement them.
And sadly, sometimes that's probably one of the most frustrating things as a kind of a clinician researcher is sometimes, especially when you do have a larger or growing body of evidence and you have numbers that show that it will save money, downstream costs, and it still doesn't necessarily get implemented. Um,
Yeah,
and that's one of the challenges, which, we realize a lot of health policy is politics, which gets
yeah.
messy in and of its own right. And that's a whole nother conversation, discuss politics, and I don't want
Yeah,
to
and
get
I think that, that if we think about what we're trying to change with rehab or with palliative care, the modifiable factors in the person, often they're kind of hugely heterogeneous,
Mhm.
and it's hard to kind of plan a service, a very protocolized service that meets everybody's needs, and you can end up underdosing some patients, overdosing others. Lisa Nottelman, one of the partners on the Inspire trial, had a wonderful, I was with her recently, and she gave this wonderful visual that we often the interventions we give people are very, very similar combinations of symptom management, rehab, psychological support, spiritual, financial support. But we have different doors that people can come in through. And if your service is a symptom management service, a breathlessness intervention service, somebody has to have breathlessness to get in. If you've got a service which is for frail elderly, they've got to be a frail elderly to get in.
Mhm.
But once they get in, they're all getting a very similar
Mhm.
Yeah.
toolbox of interventions, but why we put all these different doors on. um
Yeah.
Yeah,
So frustrating.
it
Yes,
is.
it
Yeah, and
really
and
is.
that's where you know, I think that is one of the challenges when it comes to really showing a lot of the evidence about, what in palliative care works, because every patient is so different and they have such unique personalized needs. And a little bit I want to, shift gears and hear all about the Inspire project that you've kind of been teasing for us for the past half hour or so, which is amazing. But that's where, at least in my organizations, I really kind of want to encourage a lot of younger professionals to publish case reports and to really, I think there's a huge value, especially in palliative care situations, because right now we're teaching our students, if you don't know something, go to the literature. If you don't know how to handle a patient, go to the research, and then embarrassingly, they'll go to the research and there's crickets, and there's not a whole lot. So we're kind of
Tumbleweed.
setting them up for failure. But at least, we certainly know that there's, meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials and really, really high level of research that's needed. But sometimes it does have to start with just tell a story about a patient and how it went. And even if things didn't go great, at least some of these clinicians have a place to start. And if we get enough case studies, that maybe could lead to a cohort study or some other type of trial, and then kind of work its way in. So I think there's a lot of power in the clinician story and sharing that amongst ourselves.
Yeah,
And
I think
Chrissy,
so
the
too.
other, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just gonna say, I think a lot of rehab techniques, we have kind of particular interventions which are very visible and easy to explain, like provision of assistive devices. They're obvious. Exercise classes, it's visible and obvious. But a lot of what we do is problem solving, problem solving activities, problem solving movement, problem solving, tasks and behaviors. And that's harder to define. It's harder to visualize and conceptualize until you need it. If you speak to somebody who's had a family member who needs rehab, they understand it, they get it. But until you experience it, it's very hard often, I think, to conceptualize it. Yeah, so we just need to shout out better, I think, for our problem solving expertise.
Yeah.
And because that research to practice gap is not getting any, whatever they say,
Yeah.
7 years, right? Like you were saying, Chris, like by the time you get something in, but with the case studies, it's a little bit more tangible, right? Like it's almost, I feel like I can take that nugget of information and tie it. And so, implementation science is this whole growing field, right?
Yeah,
So
massive.
how can we, really shorten that research to practice gap and try to implement some of these things, because patients need it now.
Yes.
All the things we're talking about, this access and anything. So we'd love to learn more about Inspire. I could go on.
Well, yeah. So Inspire it's just a joy to work on. I'm working with some amazing people, and I just can't believe it. I'm still in a bit of shock that it's actually happened. It started when I was working in the hospice in Liverpool, in the grounds of Aintree Hospitals. I don't know if you've heard of the Aintree races. And it was a patient who had been coming to the hospice for a little while. And at the hospice, like I said, it was a very rehab-focused hospice. We had physiotherapists, psychologists, nurses, doctors, social workers, and he'd come with a range of concerns as people. He had stage 4 lung cancer, and he was just so impressed with kind of how the care had wrapped around him and how all his needs were being addressed. And he said to me, he was in the gym. He was in our hospice gym program, and again, he was stunned that we had a gym with exercise bikes and weights in a hospice.
Awesome. I'm
And
stunned.
yeah, and he said, why wasn't I offered all this when I was diagnosed 6 months ago? Why was I only offered chemo? Why was I only offered drugs that made me feel worse? And that was my research question. That was when I went to do my PhD, which is looking at, well, how do we design rehab for this population? And this is focused on cancer. I think palliative care is much broader than cancer, but when you're getting research fundings, you often have to focus on a small group. And the rehab that I was familiar with, the kind of highly intensive cardiac pulmonary rehab, which was very exercise based and took people into gym sessions, it would definitely suit some of my patients, but it wouldn't suit my patients who had a lot of comorbidities, who were very frail, who had a lot of symptoms. And those patients were also still quite busy. Even palliative patients with cancer are going for palliative radiotherapy. They're having their appointments with their oncologists and their nurses and then to manage their different symptoms. And they're also a hugely heterogeneous population, in terms of age and comorbidity. Some of them are still quite fit. They're stage 4 cancer, but they're still quite fit. They're still trying to work, and others are very frail. So it was like, how can we design one intervention that's going to meet the needs of this whole population? And so that was what I spent my PhD looking at. And we came up with this 3-contact intervention that looks at the kinds of issues that stop people from functioning when they're in the palliative care setting with cancer. So it's symptoms that impact on function. It's changes to physical fitness and also beliefs around movement and fitness. And that was something that came out to me clinically, that people stopped moving. I call it the sit down syndrome when they get advanced cancer, not because they haven't got the fitness, but because of their beliefs and their fears around cancer.
Mhm.
So, Chris will have heard me tell this story at the conference in Amsterdam last year, but a patient who told me once he was very breathless. He was still able to drive, but he was absolutely panic stricken with breathlessness. And I asked him, where did he think his lungs were? I always asked patients, where did they think their lungs were? Because patients have really weird views on where they are. And some people think they're this big. And he told me his lungs were two pipes, two tubes, actually, two tubes with pipes coming off them. And I said to him, what's at the end of the pipes? Thinking he'd say air sacs. And he said, well, my heart and my kidney and my liver. So he knew he had solid lung tumours. And he thought that when he got breathless, he was just going to drop dead because his pipes were blocked.
Mhm.
And so
Very
the intervention looking at symptoms and movement was also looking at the beliefs that patients have around their illness that impact on symptoms and movements, and then how thirdly that impacts on social participation and what they can participate in their family life and their social life. So I wanted an intervention that targeted all three of those things, that fitted in with their time, the amount of time they wanted to put into rehab, because I think reading Andrea Chevel's work, one of the great American palliative rehab researchers and cancer rehab researchers, patients don't want to spend a lot of time being burdened with medical things. They want to live their lives in this foreshortened time. And another American, have you read Paul Kalanithi's book, When Breath Becomes Air?
Yes, I actually listened to
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and he talks about he wants to know how much time he's got left, because if he's got quite a bit of time, he's prepared to put effort into exercise. But if he hasn't, there's other things he wants to do. So we wanted an intervention that would identify 3 sessions, because that's enough time to identify what matters to people, what their functional limitations are, and those 3 sessions would be very much focused around the person's functioning. Other members of the multi-professional team are looking after other aspects of their well-being, their psychological well-being, their spiritual well-being, their medical symptoms and so on from a medical perspective. We wanted to look at it from a functional perspective, and we thought that most patients can manage 3 contacts with a rehab professional. I didn't want it to be physio or OT, I wanted it to be rehab, because it was around functioning, and I wanted any member of the medical healthcare team with rehab focused skills to be able to deliver it. And I was thinking globally as well, in countries that don't have a good service of physios and OTs, where it might have to be delivered by community health workers. So it was very much focused on what are the actual rehab techniques and interventions and strategies. And if it's 3 contacts, then at the end of that 3 contacts, the person can be signposted to other services, which are going to be able to support them on their pathway according to their unique set of circumstances. The risk is that you could do an Inspire intervention in some contexts and there isn't anything to signpost them onto, only self-management, and that is a risk. And that we'll find out with Inspire, because we're doing Inspire across 5 countries, and 6 countries now. Actually, Czech Republic has joined, so 6 countries, and it'll be interesting to see, because we're evaluating where people get referred onto, what is available for people to be referred onto. But that was how Inspire came about. It was to design a rehab program that was accessible to people with advanced disease, that would meet their initial needs, but also link them in with existing services that could continue to support them. Maybe lobby existing services. Like I know in the UK, some pulmonary rehabilitation services now do open to people with lung cancer. And there's the service in Ayrshire that I told you about. They're often exercise based, but hopefully we can, as we build the evidence, we can look at, does all rehab have to happen in a healthcare setting? What is there in our community? How can we resource our community groups, our lay-led community groups, to not be afraid of people coming along with advanced disease? How can we support people in their communities to still be alongside each other as we're aging and dying? So that was a big long waffle, big ramble. You can cut that out.
Wow, that's amazing. So I'm going to put it in there, but I think for people to find out more about the Inspire program, I see the website palliativeprojects.eu
Yeah.
/Inspire. Is that the best way for people to kind of get
Yeah,
that?
that's the best way to. If you just put any combination of palliative, rehabilitation, Inspire, and EU into a browser, you'll come up with it. And we've got
Okay.
a pink, mustard, dark green, and teal logo.
Yeah. And
Inspire. It's about what matters to me.
I love
That's
it.
our tagline.
That's
And
awesome.
I love
That's
that you
awesome.
had an amazing acronym for it too. So integrated short-term palliative rehabilitation and curable cancer. I mean, and that's one of the coolest acronyms that I could think of. So congratulations on that alone, let alone the success of the program.
Yeah, and and it's exciting because we've got people on the team. It's not all physios and OTs. We've got rehabilitation physicians on the team. We've got methodologists on the team and statisticians. So it's a really interesting team, and the cultures across these European countries are also varied. Going back to the policy brief, at the end of the policy brief, there are 5 case studies, and I can see the Inspire intervention in some of those case studies. The components of the Inspire intervention aren't new. Any physio or OT would recognize that these are things that they do in their daily practice. What we've done is it's how we've combined them. And it's the model of care, I suppose, and the timing of it. But the case studies at the back of the policy brief demonstrate the variance across cultures. So one of the case studies in Italy, they don't have any occupational therapists, and in one of the other case studies, they have more OT and less physio. So it is interesting about how different cultures understand the roles of these different rehab professionals.
Yeah, and as important as it is for all of us to understand each other's roles, I love that you just do rehab, because
Yeah.
I've been trying to focus more on that as well. Like, just like we're all in this space together, and we can draw little lines between us if we want, but that's really
Exactly. Then
helping
it's
us.
about us.
Yeah,
It's all about us. It's not about
yes,
them.
exactly.
Like
Exactly.
I can remember being really surprised that occupational therapists in America do quite a lot of exercise training. They're trained to prescribe exercise. Great. But over
Yes,
here, they're not. In
I
the
know.
UK, they're not. So, but it's fantastic that we've got this kind of variety, because then it means, well, let's expand our boundaries. As long as you've got the competencies to do the tasks, what
Or
matters
know
most.
when to get help if you don't, right?
Exactly. When you know the limits of your own practice, but what's important
Yeah.
is, are the patient's needs being addressed? It's about what matters to them. And how,
And
as a team, do we meet those needs?
And the same with speech therapy, because we've been doing, in my little program, we have an OT, PT, speech, chaplain, and we're trying to get just everybody be able to sort of, understand know when you really need to call speech, and know when you can do some positioning and some other things that might at least add a little value to that patient in the moment. So
yeah, and speech is a great one, and we haven't got that in Inspire. I mean, that will be one of the things that we would signpost to if that was one of the issues we picked up. But I know from working clinically that, especially when people's language is their communication is going to deteriorate, like we anticipate getting speech therapists in before that happens, so they can start planning communication strategies in advance and all the strategies that they have. And then the other one, of course, is dietitians and how often malnourishment is missed. And the important social function of food, and all I'm sure you two have experienced it as well with your patients, that the tensions that can create in families with when patients don't want to eat and people cooking for them, and the role that dietitians can play in helping to support people to eat still for pleasure and optimize their nutrition without burdening, so that we're almost like the four musketeers, aren't we? OTs, physios, speech pathologists, and dietitians.
And I always bring up the example of, at least in the States, I mean, there's a lot of big push for exercise, but we really do have to be careful if a lot of these folks are not intaking enough calories. I mean,
Yeah.
burning a lot more calories and you're just not taking them in.
Yeah, and if they're not maintaining their
More trouble.
protein, and exactly. And it's I get really frustrated when especially in oncology, when rehabilitation gets conflated with exercise. I think exercise and physical activity are really important parts of rehabilitation, but there is so much more to rehabilitation than exercise. In fact, one of my patients in one of my pre-PhD studies, I was interviewing patients with lung cancer again about rehabilitation, asked them what comes into your mind when I say the word rehabilitation. And one lady said Amy Winehouse, and to her, rehab was drugs rehab. So, and it is, rehabilitation is mental health as well. It's not just an addiction, it's not just physical. So
interesting. Yeah. With regards to the eating thing too, having lost my brother to lung cancer and had him in my house family was under hospice. You know, the feeding thing, I find myself like I was trying to feed him, doing exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I find my role now when I work, especially more in home health than in the hospital, is supporting families around that, because
yeah,
families think that that's their job, that this is going to keep them alive, that the food, you know,
yeah,
and really trying to just support the family member and understanding that, you know, pleasure feeding is fine, but we're not going to force it, and all
yeah,
those things. It's really a more holistic view of what a family's role is. And I think we, at least in the US, we do a lousy job of really managing the grief and the loss at the family side, or whoever. And when I say family, I mean whoever the
yeah.
people
I
are
totally. Yeah.
around
It could be
you.
neighbours, it could be best friends. Yeah, and you've raised
Whoever.
a really important point there, Anne, which I don't think we've covered very much so far, and that is the central role of the significant others in that person's life, whether it's their family or whoever. And I think rehabilitation is so much more effective when we include the people who are
Yeah,
important to the person. It's so hard for people to take on. We expect patients to take on so much information when they're ill. And in an Inspire, we are encourage, you know, where it's the person wants their caregiver to be present or their significant others, they're very welcome to participate in the intervention, because whatever strategies we're working on with the person, they're going to be more likely to fit if we
of
get
course.
the perspective of everybody who's going to be in the home and participating in that. I have to say, in the feasibility trial, there were a few patients who wanted parts of the intervention on their own. They wanted to be able to talk freely,
Mhm.
and we have to be sensitive to that.
Yes.
But yeah, the opportunity to consider the caregivers' needs, and I think a lot of caregivers, we assume they can do all the manual handling issues,
Oh,
the
yeah.
movement issues, and the fear that people have um, around handling their loved one's body and touch and movement, especially
Mm.
towards the end of life. And if we can give the carers confidence around the body and
Yeah.
around movement, how to help somebody to stand from a chair, simple everyday things, how to help them be comfortable in bed, how to help them to just move gently in bed when they're getting stiff and uncomfortable. Such massively important strategies, and it's all part of the intervention.
Yes, and I showed this same husband that I was talking about today not to grab his wife's arm because she had a met in her. I said, just, you know, grab the chuck, or whatever we call it, chuck here, or the pad, you know,
Yeah,
you know, so little things like that that I don't think anybody else really thinks about, right? Where, how are we going to toilet? And toileting is one of those things that many patients would like to be able to do for themselves if that's
yes,
possible, right?
yeah,
You know, they don't want their daughter or whoever
no,
having to help. And that's, you know, we're listening to that, I think, more than
yeah.
sometimes the physicians are, at least here. You know.
And I think that's where, you know, people might hear the example of, you know, positioning in bed for comfort. It's like, well, that's care. Well, it's care when we're doing it, but it becomes rehab when we're enabling a family to manage that for themselves. And that's where nurses participate in rehab. There's a wonderful definition that's come out from the Cochrane group, I think, Negrini et al. And they're looking at trying to create a working definition of rehabilitation for research, and what a slippery concept rehabilitation is. You know, what does it mean? You know,
Yeah.
from the Amy Winehouse effect to pulmonary rehab, you know. Um, and they've created this working definition kind of based around the PICO, you know, the population intervention outcome acronym. And it's really very useful. And what they say, rehab in the definition, and I would support this, is an approach to care. It's a multi-professional approach to care that targets functioning. So a physio prescribing exercise on its own is not rehab. It
Yeah.
becomes rehab when it's fits
Yeah.
in with all the other elements of rehab. So checking somebody on the stairs before they go home, or giving them a walking aid, that's not rehab.
Yeah.
Rehab is the whole package of care that goes around that, making sure they've got their symptoms controlled so they can actually get up and use their walking aid, making sure they've got the ramp so they can get in and out of the house, making sure they've got the confidence their carer can get in and out the car. It's the whole thing.
It's
Um,
holistic, right? It's that holistic piece. Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So, well, we've talked about a lot. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that really maybe like a bee in your bonnet, or something that you feel like we want to be able to make sure that we share before we We let
I
you
think for
go into
I
that?
think for me the biggest thing we have to change is this: we have to move the model of rehab from the restorative to the whole life course. So rather than thinking about does somebody have the potential to benefit from rehab, what do we mean by that? Who's benefiting here? Is it the health service unit that manages to get them discharged, or what's the benefit to the person? And I can remember talking to my I have an American sister-in-law who's a physical therapist and worked in cancer services, and when she talked to me about my patients in the hospice, she said we wouldn't get referred people like that here.
Yeah.
We might be asked to give them a stick, but that would be it, or a walking aid.
Yeah.
And she said because they haven't got potential to benefit. And Matt Maddox, my boss, talks about rather than have they got potential to benefit, have they? It's sorry, rather than have they got? Oh, I'm gonna lose. You're gonna have to snip this bit out.
That's okay. We've talked a lot.
Yeah. Have they? And it's important to get this right around. Have they got rehab potential? We normally say, have they got rehab potential? And we should
Right.
flip it round to be, have they got potential to benefit?
Yes, yes.
That's what we switch it round to.
Yeah.
And I think if we need to provide the rehab at the right time, so they've got potential to benefit. And if rehab is offered too late, if we wait, so
Yes.
many of the techniques that we do and the strategies that we do are anticipatory. We're
Mhm.
planning for, we're anticipating ahead, we're problem solving before it becomes a problem.
Mhm.
So it needs to be proactive. And I think a lot of rehab services in cash strapped health systems are reactive.
Mhm.
And then that puts patients in the situation where they're competing for rehab therapist time. So I think we need to move more proactively and be more needs led rather than disease led, rather than condition led, so that people who get the rehab when they need it, not when their condition says they need it, or their service says they need it, or their insurance company says they'll pay for it.
So
Yeah.
early palliative care and early rehab,
Yes.
better
Yeah.
outcome, right?
And I think it's going to take a lot of blurring of boundaries and people being prepared to give up maybe certain
Mhm.
controls. It's
Mhm.
going to take physicians to blur boundaries as well and
Yep.
be less possessive about their teams. Your podcast with the physio and the social worker about the movement of patients between all the acronyms in it. What do you call
Yeah.
those skilled nursing?
A
Skilled
SAR,
nursing facilities, yeah.
yep,
Oh
yep.
my goodness.
SNFs,
No,
SAR, ECFs, yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
it
Yeah.
drives me bananas. We have, this disconnect across service lines. We have disconnect
Yeah.
among who's on it makes me crazy. I just want to knock all these barriers down.
But I also really like what you're doing with your education systems as well. I think we have to massively raise the confidence of therapists in other areas of practice to work with people who are deteriorating and to see that they can gain really meaningful outcomes for people in those other service areas. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
So it's
because they're,
great that we're getting this transatlantic
yeah, I love it. I love it.
interaction. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. While they're still alive, because they're still alive. You know what I
There's-
mean? Like we until the end, we need to
yeah.
continue to add value and improve quality of life.
Yeah. Can I finish? There's one of the other Javi Carrel quotes, Dr. Javi Carrel, HAVICAREL. She talks about how when she goes to see the doctor, she has a terminal respiratory condition. She's still alive, amazingly. She's responded very well to treatment, but when she was diagnosed, she was told it was terminal. And she said when she used to go to see the doctors, all they were interested in was her body and her disease and her symptoms. And she says, nobody seems to want to know how my life has changed and how they can help me. And I think that's what we do as rehab professionals. We talk to people about how is your life? What's your day like? How can we help you to do the
Mm,
things in your day that you want to do? Yeah.
yes, 100%. Yes. What brings you joy? How can we get
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
Even just a little bit. Yeah.
And sometimes that means that we have to let go of things we think we can do.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like I think you've got the potential to get a bit stronger. You're sitting down all the time. You're just going to get weaker. But that's okay. That's how they're adjusting and adapting. I have to let go of what I want for the patient and center what they want.
Yes.
Sometimes they don't know what this is possible, so there's some information giving there. But when they've had that information and they still say no, we have to let go.
Yeah, we do. We do. Goal concordant care, right?
Yeah.
what a
As you
great
can hear, I can
example.
talk forever about this.
Yeah.
No, so could I. We both could. All three of us could talk for another 3 hours.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe this is the start to ongoing conversations like this.
Yeah.
I think it
Well,
will
it's
be.
an exciting time because we hopefully within the next 4 to 6 weeks we'll recruit our first participants to Inspire.
Yay.
So yeah, we're just about to submit a paper which is mapping the rehab services across the sites who are participating in the intervention. That's going to get submitted soon. But hopefully you'll follow us and we'll get to talk again when we get some results.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
We will
Yeah.
certainly be posting the Inspire project and the World Health Organization policy document on our website. So
Yes.
everyone who's listened to this or watched this video can also kind of get a little bit of context for that. So,
Yeah.
sincere thank you for your time,
Thank you.
expertise, and your generosity, especially because it's getting close to nighttime. It's mid-afternoon, as you can see from Anne's window, but it's getting
Yes.
close to bedtime probably for you. So we really
Yes.
appreciate it and look forward to working with you and collaborating with you in the future.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for
appreciated.
inviting me. And if your
Thank you.
listeners have any comments that they want to feedback to me, I'd really be grateful to hear from them. I'd love to hear from them. So
All right.
Awesome.
All right.
thank you
Thanks a
so
lot.
much.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.